Greetings, everyone. Sorry for running a bit late, but we are here and we're glad to welcome you to our seventh, count them, our seventh disability filibuster in 7 weeks in the 2022 series. We are still very much here with a lot of help from our friends. You know who you are and who you aren't. We are still here. We're showing up and still speaking truth to power. My name is Catherine Frizzy. I'm going to take a stab today at hosting solo. And I'll say a bit more about myself and introduce our guests in a moment. But first things first, safety is first. The disability filibuster, as many of you will know by now, it is a CRIP space. And part of what it means to be a CRIP space is that it must be a safe space for all. And that is the primary reason why, regrettably, for example, we have to hold these gatherings as webinars rather than open gathering spaces. But we are making it work. And if any of you in the audience have questions or thoughts or interventions of any kind, please use the Q&A box or reach out to us on Twitter, and we will respond or note what you have entered. Our focus today is going to be disability, mature minors, and MAiD. And the other part of creating a safe space, particularly given the topic that we're going to be addressing, is to make sure that everyone who is joining us today knows that we will be talking about some very difficult subjects. Subjects like depression, self-harm, suffering, death, and suicide. So please, everyone, take care to keep yourself safe. Take a break if you need. Tune us out if you need. You can watch us later with a friend if that feels safer. Do whatever you need to, please, to find support and seek support when you need it. And that goes for all of us as well as everyone in the audience. Okay? All right. We'd like to begin our filibuster broadcasts with an acknowledgement of the lands that sustain us, and the people who have cared for these lands long before us. We don't have a special guest today to perform that important role by themselves, but instead we have agreed that we're all going to pitch in and do this collectively. When we do difficult work, like the work we do here at the filibuster, when we face obstacles or opposition, when we are disrespected, marginalized, abused, hurt, or cast aside, it is, after all, the land that holds us, the land that honors us, the land that sustains us. And so before we introduce ourselves, we're each going to take a turn to introduce our relationship to the land. We're going to name the lands where we live or work. We're going to say a few words or even tell a story about a place on this land that is sacred or special to us, a place where we go for healing or peace. In this way, we will take a moment in solidarity with the land and its stewards, grounding ourselves before we begin the conversation. Ramona, I think I'll start with you, please.
Sure. I am here today with you from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenapehouk, and the Attawandaron. And I am also from, other people might know it as London, Ontario. And it is beautiful here. I originally come from Montreal, where it's much colder. And right now there are magnolias and blossoms in bloom everywhere. And the fragrance and the beauty give me great joy.
It's very beautiful. Thank you, Ramona. Sonia.
Hello, I'm tuning in from Hamilton, Ontario, which is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. And a really special place for me here is a park nearby where I love to sit and reflect and enjoy the incredibly beautiful trees and find a place where I can be still. Thank you.
Lovely. Tara.
I am in Treaty 6, which is known as the Papa-Chase First Nations land. It's also known as modern-day Edmonton, Alberta. And it is a beautiful, beautiful area. The sun is always shining, even if there's a blizzard, which we have a lot of. The scenery is like rolling hills in most areas, and there's an abundance of many different types of trees, and there's always wildlife around. I think it was last month, there was a moose going through my neighborhood, full grown, a little bit lost, but that's okay.
Wow. And Rain.
Hey there. So just like Sonia, I'm tuning in from what is colonially known as Hamilton, but it's the land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, governed by the dish with one spoon, wampum, which is a wampum that asks the people who are on this land to share in the resources that are here and to honor both our relationships to each other as people, but also all of the creatures and things that sustain themselves on this land. And I recently moved to Montreal, which is traditionally known as Ganyegehaga. But I'm glad to be home and to see the all of like the lush greenery in Hamilton and the water here. I've missed it a lot. So yeah.
Wonderful. And I'm coming in from Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, where we are all bound by the treaties of peace and friendship. That's what they were called. Mi'kmaq is otherwise known as Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia is typically known either for its lush and fertile valleys and farmlands, or for its lovely touristy sandy beaches and pounding surf. But my favorite place, and the place where I live, is on the rocky coast. It's a harsher coast, but it has a magnificent raw beauty. And my favorite place here is a place that we call Windswept Cove. And it's named Windswept because the wind hits it pretty hard. It's a small cluster of trees, very old trees that have weathered many, many storms from the northeast and from the northwest. And you know what happens to old trees when they weather, they begin to lean, and they lean further and further every year. And the amazing thing about this coast in Nova Scotia is that there's barely any soil on the rocks. But the trees, even though they are at an impossible angle, sometimes 45, 50, 60 degrees, they cling to the rocks and they cling to each other. You see their roots and the way that they entwine and hold each other, and the way the trees take a beating, but they continue to give. They give shelter to birds and to squirrels and to all manner of insects. And they give shelter to us humans as well. And it's a place that is very special to me. So thank you everyone for those grounding moments. It's good, I think, in Zoom to remind ourselves that we are embodied and that we have connections to land. So we have a small and really lovely group with us today, and I'm looking forward to everyone meeting each other and introducing yourselves to our audience. So let's do a round of introductions. I'll start out. I'm Catherine Cousy. I use she, her pronouns. And I'll give a bit of a visual description for people who aren't facing a screen. I'm an older white woman with graying hair that is pulled back. I said older, I think old would actually be a perfectly good word in this case. I'm wearing old lady spectacles. I'm wearing a blue shirt over an orange t-shirt, which I chose today because every child, every young person matters. Behind me, there's a bookcase, and in front of me, there's a microphone and a number of tubes that I use for breathing and other bodily purposes. So that's where I am and who I am. And now let's invite our other guests to introduce yourself and give a little bit of a visual description. Tara, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you, Catherine. My name is Tara, and I am female, I identify as female. So she, her, but I'm hard of hearing, so I nearly answer to everything. Anyways, I have shoulder length brown hair, dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a black and white polka dot shirt today, just because I can. So that's basically me in a nutshell.
Okay. All right. Sonia.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Sonia Kumar. My pronouns are she and her. So I am a slim woman in her 30s. I have light brown skin. I'm of mixed descent, South Asian and Canadian. I have my dark hair in a ponytail. It's curly. I'm wearing a black long sleeve shirt, and my background is actually a fake Zoom background. And it's an office space with some desks and a couple of monitors and some chairs. And I'm wearing large black and red glasses.
Okay, and Ramona.
So my name is Ramona. I use the pronouns she, her. I am a brown lady with long black hair and bangs, sitting in a room with a picture of an eagle painted by an Indigenous artist friend of ours, a blue eagle.
Okay, and over to you, Rain.
I'm Rain. I use he, him pronouns. I am a brown trans mask person. I've got closely cropped black hair, wearing overhead headphones, and a white tank top with black and orange designs. And yeah, behind me, you can see King Street, which is a street in Hamilton. And I'm sitting on a patio. There's like kind of black fencing behind me and some trees and buildings and the hustle and bustle of King Street. So, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, so we're here to talk about mature minors. The current legislative joint committee is working on 5 big topics all at once, it seems, and one of those topics is the expansion of our current MAiD law to persons who are in the category of mature minors, persons under the age of 18. And it's a very particular term of art in law and medicine, the phrase mature minors. And so we thought it would be helpful before we start our conversation to have a bit of a framing so that we're all using the phrase consistently, and so we know how the concept applies in healthcare and what it would mean in the context of MAiD. And Ramona, who will tell us a little bit more about herself in a moment, very kindly volunteered to present some of that kind of basic information to get us started. So I think, Ramona, if you're good, let's do that now. And I'll just give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everybody. I'm a family doctor, and my practice is largely comprised of people who find themselves on the margins, and many people who live with poverty or who have disabilities. And that's a little bit about my background. And so in terms of this mature minors, at the passage of Bill C-7, the Liberal government stated its intention to study and consider expansion of MAiD, medical assistance in dying, so assisted suicide and euthanasia, to mature minors. And mature minors are children who have been deemed competent, and we'll get into the ages a little later on, but that's what a mature minor is. And the Special Joint Committee, as Catherine mentioned, is currently studying many different things and will shortly take on studying MAiD for mature minors. The Supreme Court case, the Carter case, is the case that led to the decriminalization of MAiD. And many proponents of MAiD on social media right now are saying that, you know, the Carter case as a landmark case has led to this being a right for all, and therefore should also be a right for mature children. The Carter case was very clear in its ruling that it was limiting its decision to the particulars of that case, as well as that MAiD should be voluntary and for adults. So actually it didn't weigh in on mature minors. But proponents of assisted suicide again say that, well, they deserve that right. So then in looking in terms of the law and children and capacity, the law recognizes that the capacity for decision-making of children has to be evaluated considering many complex factors. So emotional, physical, mental development, values and preferences, all these things must be considered by the assessor. And the court applies a sliding scale to capacity, meaning that the more serious the decision that the child has to make, the more seriously the assessor needs to decide if that child actually has capacity. And most people, when they talk to me about this, they think of like a mature minors means like a 16 or a 17-year-old. In Quebec, there is a cutoff age of 14. Usually we say that someone over 14 likely is considered to be a mature minor. But in the rest of the provinces, it is up to the assessor to decide whether that child has capacity. And capacity means that the child understands the information given to them, appreciates it, is able to reason, and then make a clear communicated decision. And so here in Ontario, where I practice, I have seen, for example, children as young as 10 or 11 being deemed as capable and refusing psychiatric care. But the court does recognize that there are some things that there should be a prohibition on for children to protect them. So for example, smoking, cigarettes, alcohol, these kinds of things are not to be sold to people under 18. And it's important to note that with MAiD for minors, the child would not just be consenting to future health problems with using these substances, but rather to having no future at all. And while this discussion is important about capacity, it really it kind of doesn't hit at the kind of the basis of what people are concerned about, which is child development. So current medical evidence confirms that adolescence judgment continues to develop well into adulthood. I'd like to read you a quote from the American Academy of Pediatrics that states, "Although the size of the brain merely reaches its adult size in early childhood, we know that much of the brain has continued dynamic changes in gray matter volume and myelination into the third decade of life. The prefrontal cortex, where many executive functions are coordinated, including balancing risks and rewards, is among the last areas to mature." So the long time frame for full brain development explains the risky behaviors that can sometimes be observed in adolescence. As a family doctor, when I am considering or doing an adolescent health screening, there is an emphasis on safety and inquiring about at-risk behaviors, and preventative counseling is prioritized with the goal of preventing injury and premature death. And that's specific to this age group. So what are the potential dangers of expanding medical assistance in dying to children? The Canadian Association of Suicide Prevention has released a statement, I think earlier this year, pointing out that MAiD outside of terminal illness is suicide, is assisted suicide. And in considering how MAiD offered to adolescents will affect their whole peer group, I think it's important to understand that adolescents have high rates of depression, and we have evidence documenting the phenomena of teenage suicide clustering or contagion. And I have met with Indigenous elders from Atlantic Canada all the way to BC, and they have shared with me in different forums that when one of their youth commits suicide, they are steeped in suffering, but they're also bracing and trying to prevent an onslaught of suicides in the coming days in their community because of the despair that spreads. So risk factors for suicide include being exposed to messages that promote suicide and knowing someone who is engaged in self-harm. Therefore, if we increase suicide messaging and offering MAiD to minors, coupled with the increased likelihood of us knowing someone who will have completed suicide through MAiD, this will likely impact suicide contagion and the overall suicide rate of our young people. And imagine especially that the suicide messaging is being presented by the Canadian government or a medical establishment to minors, possibly before they have the ability or maturity to understand that governments can be mistaken, corrupt, or not have their best interests at heart. So that messaging coming from the government with suicide contagion is a big concern for a lot of us. In focusing on the Indigenous angle, because of colonialism and intergenerational trauma perpetuated by systemic discrimination and policies that do not favor Indigenous persons, Indigenous youth have higher rates of mental illness and suicide completion. In light of this, our federal government pushing for MAiD for children, including Indigenous children, while consistently ignoring recommendations from Indigenous stakeholders across Canada to implement youth suicide prevention strategies and the promotion of mental wellness in youth is disturbing to me. Relevant to this, slightly offside, but relevant to this is that last Friday, May 13th, the Canadian government tabled the expert panel on MAiD for mental illness. And notably, 2 panel members resigned before the report was released out of 12. While the report acknowledges that the expansion of MAiD for mental illness posed risks to certain marginalized groups, the panel did not recommend any new safeguards to Bill C7 for mental illness. And while scientific groups have concluded that irremediability, like will it never get better, cannot actually be predicted in cases of mental illness, the panel provides no specific guidance on the threshold for determining when we should allow MAiD. So if the panel report is accepted by the government, MAiD for mental illness, which will potentially also be rolled out to children, will also be based on just the assessor's opinion of the person in front of them with no standardized safeguards in play. I am going to end with international evidence, but I just want to quickly read to you guys in terms of looking at this Indigenous angle. My friend and comrade, Dr. Rod McCormick, couldn't be here today, but said that I could read his brief. I'm not going to read his whole brief. I'm just going to read a part of it. But I really do suggest, if you have time, the AMAD committee has published its briefs for this session, and Dr. McCormick's brief is there, so you can read the whole thing if you'd like. So Shegon, my name is Rod McCormick. I'm Mohawk. I have grave concerns over the extension of MAiD for minors, and I use the term grave in a purposeful manner. As my partner and children are members of the Tecumloops Sewapum, and I live in their community, I experienced firsthand the impact and announcement of the 215 children's graves in the grounds of the residential school. I can clearly see the residential school from the windows of my house and can make out a glimpse of the fields in which at least 215 children have been buried in shallow graves. This attempt to conceal the bodies is in some way symbolic of the numerous historical attempts by Canada to deal with what Duncan Campbell Scott referred to as the need to get rid of the Indian problem. Those attempts have consisted of forced starvation, forced sterilization, forced relocation to reserves with unsafe, unhealthy, and crowded housing, the introduction of liquor, smallpox blankets, forced residential schooling, experimentation with malnutrition in residential schools, ignoring the contagion of tuberculosis in residential schools, the ongoing child welfare seizure of children, excessive imprisonment of Indigenous peoples in the penal system, and the list goes on. I have worked with many Indigenous youth in emotional pain who were able to recover from being suicidal. The common reflection they had was one of relief that they did not choose a permanent solution to what proved to be a temporary problem. Getting proper and timely help is key to survival. There are many barriers to attaining that help. Among them are a lack of accurate diagnosis and corresponding treatment, a racist healthcare system, a mistrust of the healthcare system that does not always have our best interest in mind, jurisdictional ambiguity, and abdication of responsibility by various governments, and the big factor, remoteness of our communities. Living on reserve and or in a remote location often means that health services are provided by nurses or nurse practitioners who are often overworked and ill-prepared to provide the range of services that are required. This is especially the case in the near total absence of palliative care services for Indigenous children and youth. And instead of making every effort to provide the range of mental health services needed by Indigenous youth to overcome their pain, we are instead imposing upon them a responsibility to decide if they should choose a government-sanctioned permanent solution to what could easily be a temporary problem. Perhaps that is where mainstream Canadian culture values fail us all. The emphasis on individual rights and individual freedom is not balanced with need for collective responsibility. I'll stop there, but really the whole brief deserves a reading. So then in terms of looking at the international evidence about euthanasia and assisted suicide in other countries, the Benelux countries, so the Benelux countries are Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, their evidence indicates that psychiatric MAiD is often chosen by those who've experienced early childhood trauma and abuse. Consider in Indigenous and other contexts, such as growing up with a disability, bullying, discrimination, poverty, or growing up as a child in a welfare system, how that might affect a child's view of themselves and influence their choice to die. The disability rights organization Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet, expresses concern. Ill and disabled children often grow up in families where non-disabled parents see their lives as burdensome, tragic, a disappointment of their hopes for the future, and not worth living. The group points to blogs of those living with disabilities who recollect a lack of positive role models and feelings of shame as a child that in adulthood resolved and were replaced with an understanding that actually it's the views of society that need to change. In terms of parent-child considerations, also, it's important to note that usually the courts only act in view of the parents if they feel that the parents are doing a bad job, right? That they fail to live up to their expectations. But if Canada allows MAiD for children, MAiD would become the ability of the government to abuse its power over parental rights, in which we need to ask ourselves, like, in the future, if we have a parent of a depressed 15-year-old, would they be helpless to stop their child from completing assisted suicide while the government supports and facilitates it? Okay, now we get to international evidence. The 2018 CCA expert working group, so the Government of Canada commissioned a Canadian group, the Council of Canadian Academies, to look at the question of expansion of MAiD to mature minors. And they noted that there was a lack of evidence of how MAiD for mature minors would affect families. They noted there's no robust evidence that captures the voices of youth on this matter in general. And troublingly, the views of minors with disabilities, Indigenous youth, and those children in the welfare system are not captured in the literature on MAiD. They also cite a lack of international evidence on which to draw conclusions. It's also important to note that there is no precedent in the world of children being allowed to turn down therapy and choose death without parental consent. So no jurisdiction in the world allows this. Belgium, which has amended its law to allow euthanasia for children, does not allow it for mental illness and restricts access significantly. Under the Dutch and Belgium law, physicians must agree that no other options are left in terms of treatments to relieve suffering. As well, in Belgium, parents need to consent to the child's request for euthanasia for terminal illness. Our current Canadian framework deems that children who are competent, so mature minors, can make decisions without parental consent. Also in Canada, current MAiD laws allow a patient to refuse all treatment and choose MAiD, even outside the end-of-life context. All these Canadian distinctions raise concerns about how the current government might expand MAiD to children and what would be allowed. So as I said before, given the fact that Bill C7 exists for disability in such an open-ended way, and the government is already planning a rollout of MAiD for mental illness, seemingly without any safeguards coming in March 2023, we can anticipate that when it rolls out to children, it will not just be for terminal illness. It will likely be for those with disabilities and mental illness as well.
Thank you so much, Ramona. That was really, it was thorough and kind of mind-blowing. We're going to just take a minute because some people may have some questions, and I know at least one of our guests has some comments arising from what Ramona has shared. Are there any questions before we go to comments? Rain or Sonia or Tara? So maybe this might be a good opportunity. I'm thinking, Tara, since you and I talked about Ramona's presentation a bit, and you had responded quite strongly to what you had heard. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yes, I read Ramona's write-up, and that discusses the mature youth MAiD. I found this concept really hit home for me immensely because a day before my 13th birthday, I was diagnosed with brain cancer, aggressive brain cancer. And basically, the next day I had brain surgery, which I was lucky saved my life, but it was a very risky procedure. The night before my 13th birthday, the medical staff came into the room and they had me, a 12-year-old, sign my own, consent for operation. I was 12 years old. I was in immense pain. I was scared. I honestly didn't have a clue what I was signing. I was just disorientated and everything. Even after the surgery and everything, I was scared and didn't know what was going on. But beforehand, when I was doing the consent, I had no clue what was going on. And even though my mom didn't want me to sign for the operation, they insisted because I was mature enough that I should sign for it. So my mom also signed just to make me feel better about things, just in case something should have happened that went bad. But honestly, I didn't really have much of a choice as it was a life or death situation for me, but I knew I wanted to live. So I had to do the signing if I wanted to continue on with my life. Basically, I was in so much pain and disorientated and I didn't even know what consent was when I was 12. To sign this, but the medical staff pushed me to do this signing, even though I didn't understand what was going on. I don't think any child should have to go through something like I experienced, whether it's a life and death situation or whether it's they just can't handle what's going on in their life for one reason or another. I think that they need to be much more mature to be making decisions like this, such as MAiD.
And Tara, I know it's really impossible to imagine, but what do you think when you look back now about whether maybe MAiD had been an option? at that time. Does that thought trouble you? Does it concern you?
At the time, I don't recall it being an option. I don't want to reveal how old I am, but it was probably about 15 plus years ago. So yeah. I'm not quite sure if MAiD was an option back then, but after I acquired my disabilities, I do recall many people and psychologists probing me. Well, I felt probed anyways, that they're like, are you happy with your life as it is? And I actually felt they were trying to get negative responses from me for one reason or another, because my life changed instantly, basically overnight. Well, after the surgery anyways. So and also some medical treatments that I had to have after the surgery to also cause other problems. But I remember multiple times medical professions, whether it's psychologists and other medical professions, are you happy with your life and things like that? And everybody's life at some point, in my opinion, you have your ups and downs, and you just kind of have to roll with some of the punches and hopefully be strong and prevail. But that's just my 2 cents on things.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Tara, you have a really important perspective on this issue. That's a pretty harrowing experience. Ramon, I'm wondering, when you hear Tara's report of giving consent, I mean, I'm a lay person, but it is somewhat alarming to me that she would, by her own experience, say I was in no position.
And also, just like in such a bad spot, right? Like, it's actually quite shocking. I hear this all the time from patients who feel like they don't, and not even just children, from adults who feel that they don't understand. No one's given them the actual information. They don't even understand what they're consenting to. Like, just as a separate issue of communicating on our, like, we often fail to actually communicate well. And then we're like rushed, overworked system, just get that signature, get that consent. And also the impact, to hear the impact on Tara, right? Like, it really disturbed her. It's so sad to hear how she felt so pressured to sign by herself, that she couldn't defer to her mother. That's problematic. Our society is really focused, like our Western society is really focused on like individual autonomy, but you know, families don't often work that way. Often we do. I mean, you have to understand how and ask the child how the family works. But a lot of families work in a kind of communal group decision making, and this helps the child feel safe, right? As they should when they're 13.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it really stands out, Tara, that memory is still so vivid for you after so many years. That's quite profound. Rain or Sonia, anything to reflect upon either Ramona's remarks or Tara's account?
Yeah, I think just to echo that, I think it's very, very concerning, and again, you know, that safety piece and not having that ability to really understand necessarily what's going on. I'd like to just speak briefly to my own experience and kind of the space in which I work. So even though my experiences weren't as a mature minor, I think they're still very relevant to the discussion. So I developed an eating disorder at 17. So at that time I was, but it got progressively worse over time. And it was very debilitating, extremely. I went through a lot of suffering. I went through a system that was trying to navigate the healthcare system as someone with mental illness, particularly eating disorders, which are really not talked about. There's very little awareness about these issues. And as a person of color, trying to get proper care was extremely traumatizing. And after about 7 to 8 years, I had been told by multiple healthcare providers that there was no hope for me, that I would likely die from this mental health issue. And I really truly believed at that time that that there was no hope for me and that perhaps my illness was terminal. So I just want to say how disturbing it is that there would be this option given, because I think it can really, really send a dangerous message. And I know for me, I'm so sorry about the ringing. I know for me, I would have taken an option like that. Definitely. And I remember having this conversation with my parents and saying, I really wish that there was an option for me like this. To give you context now, I am fully recovered. I don't consider myself as having an eating disorder anymore. I just gave birth to my first child 3 months ago. And I run a national charity called Body Brave for folks with eating disorders. So I think even in adults, when you're going through these issues and when you face trauma within the healthcare system and marginalization, and also with eating disorders, you know, depending on what you're struggling with. So for example, I struggled with bulimia. I could not function properly. I couldn't think properly. And I had been through so many years of that, that it really affected my perception of things. And the other thing is, we don't know a lot about mental health issues, period, because it's always been underfunded. We don't have the research. We don't understand them, especially issues like eating disorders. We simply do not have the research. And we know, especially in marginalized communities, that the research is simply not done. So I think it's extremely concerning and upsetting. And within my line of work, I see people recover who have been given these same sort of dire, almost a death sentence of, you're never going to get better. But somehow something changes, and we don't understand what exactly that is, but something changes and things can get better. So I think just from that point alone, that we just don't understand enough about mental illness and the brain, let alone psychiatric medications, how they actually function, that can be also very problematic. For me, a lot of the psychiatric medications that I was put on really increased my risk of suicidality. I became extremely depressed and anxious. Again, because there was a lack of understanding. I was sort of plied with these medications. So, and within the healthcare system, even now, there is very little, the voice of lived experience is, you know, very, very minor still. I am a patient voice as part of the Canadian Medical Association, which is an amazing start, but like, this isn't ubiquitous. It doesn't happen. It's still the exception that the voice of lived experience is considered. So I think it's very disturbing. And what we're really seeing now is this tremendous increase in mental health issues across Canada, and especially among minors. And a lot of minors, I'll speak to my field, but a lot of minors with eating disorders, they come off as very well spoken, and you know, they know what they're talking about. That doesn't mean their judgment is not impaired. And I think that's really important to understand. So I just feel like we're just not in a position to be able to offer those kinds of those options. Thanks for listening.
Wow, there's so much to take in, Sonia. Thank you so much for that. And yeah, and you know, just the very last thing you said sort of stuck with me. Listening back to Tara's story and thinking about my own experience, and Rain, I'll make space for you in a moment. I'm sure you want to add to this, but yeah, those of us who manage to be well-spoken are presumed to be you know, on top of it, right? I'm presumed to be fully capable, fully ready for these immense responsibilities and choices that, frankly, no one should have to make because of this brazen new option that is presented to us at times in our life when we're not dying. Ramona, any thoughts from you to directly in response to Sonia, or should we hear from Rand?
I was very moved by what Sonia had to share, and actually everything she said is so important, right? Kind of like if you appear rational, you're going to get suicide. You're going to get suicide completion now. That's where we're moving to as a society. And that mental illness, we don't actually have any scientific understanding of how to know who will never get better. Part of like a doctor, you know, we feel things, right? So the thing is, if we're feeling desperate for our patient can feel that and might start to really believe that their case is hopeless. And all of that plays into that those feelings of hopelessness. And like Sonia, I've had some patients who've been even hospitalized for years when MAiD was not legal, who are now doing super well. They're like traveling and like, it's amazing. It is a beautiful thing to see. It is a beautiful thing to see. And the thing is, people who don't have that experience in as doctors, I'm talking about, in accompanying people through the healing process of longer term of seeing how things can really turn around, and that actually we are not that good at predicting who's gonna get better or not. Like things are just so beyond us, right? Like sometimes as a doctor we think we're God and we're like prescribing this drug and that drug, but people who don't have the experience are probably more likely going to offer people MAiD who would have gotten better.
Yeah, it's powerful. Rain, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everybody. So Sonia just talked about speaking from a place of lived experience, and I would say that that's the perspective that I bring. So for context, I'm 20. So just 3 years ago, I was a minor and have had my fair share of psychiatric institutionalizations as a teenager. And when I think about Tara's story, I'm just horrified by the fact that, like, in any other context, youth, minors, are not considered capable of providing informed consent. And we've seen in the conversations around MAiD how complicated consent is to define and to categorize and to qualify, because even in the advanced directives conversation, we've heard so much about how consent can change and how if the federal government is able to undermine these very case-by-case decisions, you're not abiding by someone's consent. Consent, you have to be able to change your mind. People change their minds all the time. And so just because someone has specified something in an advanced directive, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed to change their mind later. With youth aren't, you know, I wasn't ever aware of all of my options. All the times that I've been in psychiatric holds, I haven't been privy to all the resources that might have been available to me. And as, you know, someone who, you know, I'm a trans Muslim youth, that comes with a lot of pain. It comes with a lot of beauty, but it also comes with a lot of pain, right? Like me and all my friends, I don't know a single one of us who hasn't experienced suicidality and a range of mental health issues and illnesses. And so for the government to be, you know, in entertaining this conversation around MAiD, knowing full well that, you know, mental health resources are inadequate at best. That, you know, in my own experience, I've had a mental health practitioner during a psychiatric hold talk to me about my queerness as like a sin to overcome within my journey of Islam, which is the religion that I've been brought up in. And so if that's the state of mental health care, why would you expect youth, when presented with an option, what's being presented as like an easy out, why would you expect youth not to take that without considering everything that is available to them? Disabled youth are like, there's so many studies that show that disabled youth are more vulnerable to suicidal ideation than non-disabled youth. That, you know, that disabled youth are more likely, twice as likely, to live in households that are accessing social assistance, that are in poverty. You know, we're made to feel like burdens to our families. We're not, you know, we don't see, you know, representations of people with disabilities and mental illnesses where we're thriving or living well, which is possible when we're well supported and cared for. But the government is refusing to round out those options and fund things like Ramona mentioned, palliative care, or fund things like in-home care, or acknowledge the fact that we're more likely to be abused, bullied, ostracized. And instead of addressing those things, to me, it sends a clear message that disabled youth's lives are worthless to the Canadian government. Because why would you choose to expand this aspect of MAiD over something like a mental health care professional who does know how to approach people who come from different backgrounds and like a particular lived experience of transness? That's never something I've experienced in my life, like a healthcare practitioner who knows what they're dealing with in terms of like even gender affirming care. And these are the people who are going to be pressuring kids into suicide. It just sends a very clear message, and it's horrifying.
Yeah, that, oops. So where's my mute button? Sorry. Thank you, Rain. Indeed, it is chilling. And boy, some of the aspects of the story that you told of your experiences with the incredibly harmful encounters with the people who are charged with helping you heal. It is chilling and horrifying. Indeed, it is. Other thoughts or observations? Something else struck me, Ramona, early in your presentation. But two things, actually, and I just wanted to clarify one and just kind of remark upon the other, but to clarify. So theoretically, would I be right in saying that it would be possible for a young person, if MAiD were expanded to be permissible for mature minors, that one might find oneself not free to choose to use marijuana? Well, maybe marijuana isn't a good example because it's been legalized, although you have to be 18, don't you? Not free to choose alcohol or other substances, but free to choose death. Is that the paradox we would be looking at?
Yes, Catherine. And you know, the truth is, like, this paradox even exists for adults. You know, right now it's not like we have like unlimited freedom in terms of what we can choose. There are limitations on our freedom all the time.
Yeah.
But yes, with children, there'll be things that they'll be illegal to offer them or give them. But people will be, if Dying with Dignity and CAMAP have its way, people will be offering MAiD in the informed consent process for people who the assessors feel qualify.
Right. So you can't drive a car, you can't join the army, you can't smoke cigarettes, but you could choose to die directly and efficiently and free of charge. It does really throw us back rather harshly to the question that Rain asked, which, you know, what value do they place on our lives? Yeah. The other thing that really struck me when you were speaking was this notion that we can be deemed capable of making life and death decisions at an age before we are sufficiently astute or critical in our thinking to suspect that people in positions of authority, like the government, like our treating practitioners, may not actually have our best interests at heart. You know, I think about my own coming into political consciousness. And, you know, I was a pretty sheltered child and privileged child. And boy, it took me a very long time into my adult years before I became skeptical of government and and the media and you know, all of the forces in our society of authority that we have to think critically about. It's quite a sobering recognition. Anyway, thanks so much for that. So I thought any other sort of hanging thoughts or reflections? So we did invite people who couldn't be with us. Thank you, just taking a moment to breathe. We did invite people to submit a couple of written vignettes, and we're going to listen to one of those now. And Patricia, I think I'll have you read. These are anonymous, and you can introduce it as you wish. Come on.
Sorry. Here I am. I'm Patricia. I'm Catherine's attendant. Nice to meet you all. I'm her partner too, but in this instance, I'm reading for her because her breath runs out. And it's easier if I read it because it's a little bit long. And I'll try to read slowly. If I'm going too quickly, somebody slow me down, okay? So this is from a mom. And it's pretty self-explanatory. She says, I will never forget the night where I sat in a hospital emergency room for hours as my teenage son's stomach was being pumped to rid him of the dozens of pills and alcohol he took to end his life. I was told it was very close this time. He almost succeeded. They easily threw labels at him as bipolar, depressive, anxiety-ridden, etc. They saw him as his disability. After 2 more attempts at ending his life, A strong support system was finally wrapped around him, and slowly the fog began to lift as he was starting to see the possibilities of a life worth living. 10 years later, he has a system of support and has grown into self-awareness of his disability and how to manage it. This is a success story. He has a great job, got married, and is soon to be opening his own business. I am a middle-class social worker, privileged in many ways, yet trying to activate supports around my son was so difficult. Why didn't society have the supports he needed before it reached this point? Fast forward to today, I am furious and deeply saddened. What if MAiD had been available for mature minors at this most horrible time in his and my life? He most certainly would have opted for this, and the doctors would have easily agreed. The pain of that possibility is too unbearable to even imagine, because I know what he said then and who he is now. When I tell him about MAiD and increasing access to mature minors, he just can't believe that someone like him matters so little, because he also knows what he said then and who he is now.
Yeah, thank you. That's just a minute. We'll get the microphone adjusted. There we go. Yeah, thank you to the person who wrote that in for us. It gives another pretty sobering reminder of the profound importance of what we're doing. It really is. Any thoughts or responses? Jane, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just swatting a bug away from my face.
It's one of the hazards of outdoor swimming, I guess. And Sonia, you appear to be indoors, but that could be a fiction. But, go ahead.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so just to say, and this is sort of responding a bit to what Rain had said, and also what Patricia read out as well. You know, the really important point I'm feeling is that we don't have access. A lot of folks with mental health issues don't have access to the proper supports. And when you do get the proper supports and trauma-informed care and gender-affirming care and all of those things, then tremendous transformation is possible. But we are nowhere close, not even on the map of beginning to understand what that type of care really looks like. I think we're still trying to just understand the extent of the problem, as in the problem with the system at the moment, let alone trying to even start with a solution. So how can we possibly offer an option like that? So I just wanted to bring out that particular piece.
Yeah. Yes, Tara.
Maybe I'm thinking too far ahead, but maybe there would not be as many discussions with opening up things for like MAiD for young minors. If the right supports were in place for people with disabilities or mental health challenges and other such things, if the people with disabilities and other ailments received the support and care that they needed, maybe the option of MAiD would never be coming into the picture. I had a very nice friend. We used to chat on the internet quite often. We had many hobbies and similar likes and dislikes and everything. At one point, she signed up for MAiD, and she just couldn't deal with what her life was giving her. Then eventually her life took a turn. She got a new service dog that was helping her. She was much happier, joyful, going out in the community. But then she's like, oh no, I have my MAiD appointment 2 months from now. And I'm like, well, can't you just like either delay it or stop it or cancel it? It's your life. And she's like, well, I've got to see what something's going on. And then she randomly posted online, well, my day is coming sooner than planned. They have an opening and I'm not really ready, but she felt compelled to go through it, even though her life had changed totally. And she just sadly disappeared off the internet, and we never heard from her again.
Oh my Lord, I've never heard of such a thing. Ramona, is this as shocking to you as to me?
It's very sad, Tara. And my confrere Leonie Herx, who's a palliative care doctor, talks about this all the time, that because MAiD is very procedural, and once you get into the system of MAiD, you go from one assessor to another, and then it's booked and it's done. She calls it the MAiD train. And I was contacted by a neurologist to be put in touch with a family where, and I think the daughter did speak at a press conference, but the father had gone in with some falls, and someone suggested he was there for rehabilitation and he caught an infection there, and someone suggested MAiD to him, and then they booked the first assessment. They booked MAiD before he had his second assessment, actually, and it was done. And it was done within 48 hours of the first MAiD assessment. And so I think highly, highly problematic is this kind of like competing, it's very interesting to me that Dying with Dignity has been trying to get the message out that these are parallel issues that are not related at all. I'm laughing because I'm going to cry. I'm going to cry, like I'm trying not to cry. It's very sad to me, the whole thing, Bill C7, even the way C14 is so broad, and it's just the whole thing is a disaster. But this idea that some sort of joke that they're making that like somehow the lack of options to live doesn't affect your choice to die, and yet it's done so smoothly, right? So easily. And as Leonie says, when you get on the MAiD train, it's very hard to get off. And Tara, I'm very sorry to hear the story. Like, I'm very sorry for you.
Yeah, as we all are, Tara. But thank you for bringing that story and that person's precious life into our consciousness. I think several of you have acknowledged that doctors have a lot of authority in our lives. The younger we are, I think the more this is true. And yes, once you've made an appointment with the doctor for MAiD, how likely are you to just call and say, I'd rather not do it today? You don't. That's not how it works. It's not an equal partnership.
And on top of that, I think a lot of people who are, choosing MAiD or who are suicidal, and I think that we know that there's a lot of comparisons, especially outside of terminal illness. If we look at the Benelux countries' evidence, often there's ambivalence there, right? Like as part of the disease state, there's a lot of ambivalence.
Yes.
And so if you have people encouraging you and pushing you, it can be very hard to turn that down.
Yeah.
When everything else is so difficult.
Yeah. Sonia.
Yeah, and the other piece that I think is interesting, you know, one of the arguments that is used for MAiD for mental health issues is that there's a real lack of understanding about mental illness, and that people don't understand how much suffering mental illness can cause, that it can cause equally as much suffering as physical pain. And I think that's so true, that mental illness can cause just as much suffering as physical pain. But I think that lack of understanding and that fear of mental illness is exactly why we shouldn't offer it, because we don't have an understanding. We are afraid of mental illness. We are not progressive in this area. And so until we do, until we have dealt with the long history of paternalism and this unwillingness to really look at this issue, yeah, we just can't. We can't as a society make an informed decision, and certainly not as individuals who live within the society.
You know, very disturbing to that. I tried to touch on it just a little bit because I know that we're talking about mature minors, but it's all going to be related. This expert panel has suggested that the framework of Bill C-7, which is already a disaster, which allows you to refuse all treatment and choose death within 90 days, is going to be the same rollout for mental illness. And no one can see, you can't see a psychiatrist in 90 days. And Sonia was mentioning, like, we don't have peer supports that we know are, you know, so important for people living in community and doing well. And I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's take a moment and hear another testimony or brief written comment that one of our filibuster community members has submitted. This person disclosed that they were up all night thinking about this subject and sent this report in at, I think, 9 o'clock this morning. Matthew from our back end was going to read it for us, and I'll just check to see, Matthew, if you are available to read that comment now. Yes, great. Welcome, Matthew.
Yes, I am. Hi, my name is Matt. My pronouns are he and him. And yeah, here is this person's testimony, which I will try to read slowly and then with the full weight. Quote, "Abled people don't have to imagine a world where they, on the whole, don't exist, where their lives were never possible. And when they do try to imagine it, they've told us they don't want to live anymore. They want doctors to be able to kill them on demand. They forced Bill C-7 on us. Bill C-7 not only institutes a grim and dystopian outlook, not socially progressive, but archaic, anti-progress. It invalidates and negates the existence of all of us who've lived and loved and learned and experienced life into adulthood, despite our pain and suffering. Everybody has pain and suffering, disabled bodies and non-disabled bodies. Should we all not exist? What kind of hope does that give to any teenager contemplating their future? Disability can happen to anyone at any time. Too many people who know better seem to imagine a future only available to those who fit an arbitrary and temporary norm that has been determined by the state and the mainstream to be acceptable. Sound familiar? History is repeating itself, and those of us at risk are aware of it. We want not only ourselves, but other disabled people, our people, all people, to thrive into the future, not die, not cease to exist, because our lives as we are looked upon as a burden. Imagine if MAiD was available to any teenager who felt like they didn't fit in. That's what MAiD expansion does. MAiD expansion rewards the high school bullies. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to the person who wrote those words for us. Yeah, it's a victory for the high school bullies, all right. Any thoughts or comments, anything simmering? Yes, Rain.
Hi, yes, first of all, apologies for the background music. And second of all, I need to update my description because I had to change locations. So I've now moved. I'm wearing the same thing, but I've moved into a cafe where there's a dark blue wall behind me with some paneling and like a brown cabinet with a glass case that's holding a record player in it. So that is my update for my location. And I just want to say that, yeah, this expansion to MAiD feels like youth and just disabled people in general are being punished for having needs. That, like, I can't help but feel like there's an element of carcerality that's underpinning all of the MAiD conversations, where instead of acknowledging the huge failings of the healthcare system, which, you know, have far preceded the MAiD conversation, they're opting for this cheap out. But like, even thinking back to like failures in healthcare, like currently the Ford government's, you know, the fight of nurses against Bill 124, the wage suppression bill, when nurses are already like overworked, burning out. And instead of like addressing these like staff shortages and things that are affecting the quality of healthcare that is available to people and affecting the quality of care available to people, like, why is the government choosing to streamline MAiD over fixing a healthcare system that's very broken and that fails the most marginalized people at every turn all the time? Like, none of the conversations around MAiD have featured the voices of people who are going to be the most greatly impacted. It's scary.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and Sarah, your colleague, Sarah Jama, had made that point really clearly and forcefully at the hearing on Monday. And if people haven't seen Sarah's testimony, it's well worth listening to and admiring how she navigated the difficulties that were and the curveballs that were thrown her way. But she made the point very forcefully that you're given a choice between listening to the people who have lived experience, from that lived experience, certain insights, and let's even declare that it might be wisdom to offer to this conversation, that instead our government has chosen to listen to the people who are fearful of uncertain futures. And of course, I mean, it's even more irksome because they're fearful of the very hardships that we endure and that we are fighting to do something about. So, you know, don't be afraid. Come on board and help us change things, please. It is what we all need. Yeah. Yeah, you know, it occurred to me too when you were speaking and when we were hearing, well, a number of things that people have said. Have any of us as human beings and as people with disabilities, have any of us never felt like a burden? I mean, it is a thing in our lives that we all understand. And yes, you know, we accept the support and the care that is offered to us when it is offered genuinely and without oppressive strings attached. And we give back in return. And that is the nature of the human condition, is it not? But this weight, the weight that people with disabilities especially, can be forced to carry as if we are more burdensome than other human beings. It's yeah, it's wrong. It's very dangerous. It's wrong, and in the era of MAiD, it is going to cause people to die. We are moving along quickly. These 2 hours really do move quickly. We have another question. We can, yes, there is a visitor, a member of the audience who wants to ask a question verbally. I also have a text message that I haven't looked at, so I'll look at that. But Aslan, in the back end, are you able to promote Vicky and let her ask her question?
Yes, I can do that right now, Vicky. So Vicky should be traveling through the portal.
Okay.
Okay, hi y'all. I don't know if you'll be able to see my face, so I'm gonna leave my camera off just in case, so you're not staring at my ceiling. So I'm Vicky. I'm a disability rights activist here in McMoggy, and I'm really scared because when I was 18, 19 years old, I actually asked my father to kill me. Full stop. Because I was depressed and, you know, had an eating disorder, felt like a burden to my family. I was trying to kill myself using anorexia, because it was the only way I found out that I could do it myself. So I know that if MAiD was available when I was that age, I would not be alive right now. So I'm wondering, when we say mature minors, like, what exactly does that mean? Because, like, if you go with the science, and I'm not a scientist, but what I do know is the frontal lobe doesn't finish developing, which is what you use to see long-term, you know, effects of your decisions. It doesn't fully develop to the age of 25. So how can you make these decisions about your future when you don't even have the brain capacity, like, scientifically, to see those outcomes yet? And what exactly does a mature minor mean? Does that mean a 12-year-old who is well-spoken can get it? You know, does that mean, you know, a 16-year-old doesn't have to ask her mom and can just go in and have herself euthanized? Like, what does mature minor, what's the criteria to be considered a mature minor?
Okay. Good question.
I can summarize, Victoria, a little bit. It's very complex, and I mean, thank you for sharing your story. I would say that it will depend on the assessors, which is what is terrifying about this. It's extremely complex. First of all, as you pointed out, if brain maturation isn't until 25, should someone really be able to consent? I would agree with you that it should be no. But then the question is, the capacity assessments are being done by the MAiD assessors for the most part. So I can speak a little bit about the adult regime, which is also problematic for this, in that it really depends on, there are studies from the international evidence that show that different assessors disagree on whether the patient has capacity or not. But since the MAiD assessor who is eventually giving the injection is the one who has the final say, it's usually up to them, and they tend to be pro-MAiD, which is troubling. So we can imagine, in extrapolating this to children, that if MAiD assessors think that they're providing a great mercy to a child, that they're more likely to perceive their decision and their reasoning to be rational and have capacity, which is really, really worrisome. But what I'm trying to say, I don't know if I'm being clear because I'm a little bit frazzled from all this information that's made me very sad, but is that if we have MAiD assessors who are pro-MAiD, think this is merciful, and they have a child in front of them who is rationally asking calmly, as Sonia had mentioned before, they will likely get it because of the bias of the assessor.
Initially, I was pro-MAiD when it first came out because I was under the impression, as were a lot of people with disabilities, that it would only be used if there was like literally nothing else they could do and you were just gonna suffer and die and there were literally nothing else. As someone who lives in a nursing home, I've seen a lot of people suffer and die. So I was initially pro-MAiD because I thought it was only the last resort. But now that it's not, I'm scared to even go to the hospital. Because what if they look at me and go, well, she's a quadriplegic. She has very little use of her arms. She can't walk. She goes in a nursing home, so her life must suck. We'll just offer her MAiD. I'm scared to go to the hospital because I'm scared they'll pressure me to die.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Victoria. You're really expressing, I think, a feeling that a lot of us share at this time. And, it's not that they're going to come in when we're sleeping with a needle, but we know how that environment, how those relationships of power, how the overlays of racism or transphobia or sexism are going to wear us down, and we just can't count on our safety in the same way, and we can't count on, others in other filibusters have spoken about the look that you get sometimes that says, really? Why would that person not just choose MAiD? And how that wears down your sense of self, your value, your entitlement. Yeah, it's so thank you, Victoria. I'm really glad to hear from you, and I'm glad you're among us. You've made some immense contributions since that really dark time. We have one more written submission. Oh, actually, we have this one comment that I'll just read. Maybe Pat, you could. I'll leave that with you. I think what we'll do is we'll go to just in view of the time, and we won't time to wrap up. So we have about just under 15 minutes remaining, and we do like to conclude every filibuster with a moment of silent reflection. We've certainly heard a lot from each other. We've learned from each other. We've thought of friends present and past who have suffered and who have died, who are no longer with us. And so we want to take a moment to honor those who aren't present. And I think to lead in with that, we'll start with Aslan, if you're available from the back end, to read the other written piece that was provided to us.
Mom, if you can't support my decision and sit by my bedside and hold my hand words to anyone, I couldn't. It was too heartbreaking. The image of holding my beautiful son's hand while he died was such a dreadful one. But that was what my young son told me after being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He was severely depressed and waiting for MAiD to kick in so he could end his life. He is smart. He was building up his case so that he would be accepted for MAiD, complying with the meds he was prescribed and participating in therapy via Zoom. A year has passed and he's moved out on his own. He is struggling with some things, but having fun, participating in life, making plans. There is a pattern to this, and I know he may fall into that deep pit of depression again. I don't want MAiD to be an option for mental illness. I want to scream that from the rooftops.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison, for reading that piece, and thank you to the mom who submitted it to us. We're glad that her son is still with us, but we are very aware of the risks that lie ahead for all, it seems. So let's take a moment now to just remember silently lives that were important to us and lives that are hanging in the balance now. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Maybe we can do just one round. We still have about 10 minutes. One last round, and I would ask each of you to, well, you've absorbed a lot, and you've shared a lot. If you were given a moment to speak directly to the decision makers who will be deciding on the further expansions of MAiD and who will be evaluating the expansion they set in place 1 year ago and the impacts that that has had. What is your key message to the people that we elected to govern wisely and for all Canadians. What is the key message for each of us? Who would like to start? Ramona.
My key message would be that we want to live. We want resources to live. Please don't offer us death instead as a cheap answer to our suffering.
Thank you, Ramona. Tara.
I would have to say, please listen to us. We want to live. We just need the supports to do that. And just giving us the option to check out of life is not an accommodation we need. Sure, there are some individuals who truly need the compassion of that, but I'm saying, like, giving the option of MAiD to, what would you say, mature youth is not an option. It's just the easy way out when they don't really fully understand the decisions they may be making.
Thank you so much, Tara. Sonia?
I really implore you to really not do this. And please don't offer death as an option. There is so much good that can be done in this area of especially mental health, because so little has been done. Just think about all the lives that could be changed by offering extra supports and becoming a society that's inclusive and understanding and trauma informed. Think about all the possibilities for youth and for adults and for families. That is something so beautiful to imagine. And I really implore you to put your efforts and your money and your resources and everything that you've got to that rather than death. Thanks.
Wonderful. Rain.
Yeah, so I'd say that expanding track 2 of MAiD to mature minors would be an extremely irresponsible decision for the Canadian government to make, unless it's going to address the fact that, like we've said, disabled youth are routinely denied access to treatment and mental health care supports, are twice as likely as non-disabled youth to be living in poverty, are overrepresented in welfare, are made to feel like burdens. Unless they're going to address all that, how can the government in good conscience expand MAiD to youth without funding mental health care, without addressing the rampant abuse in foster care, without making sure disabled youth are supported in every way? Because these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They aren't separate from the rampant ableism that dominates our society's view of people with disabilities. And as it stands, the Canadian government is entertaining the expansion of MAiD to mature minors to the degree that they're effectively coercing youth with disabilities into taking MAiD over encouraging us to live. And I'm scared for myself, for the people I love, and for disabled youth across Canada. And so I say, stop the expansion of C14 to mature minors.
Thank you all. There's really nothing to add except to say, you've made a terrible mistake. You've made a terrible mistake, and you must stop now. You must stop further expansion. You must look deeply into the circumstances and the tragedy of the lives that have been wasted as a result of this misguided notion of liberty. This is not liberty. This is eugenics and abandonment. Stop, or you will be held accountable. I want to take a moment now, just as we're wrapping up, to thank each of you. This was a a really difficult conversation, and one that you held up so honorably and with such kindness and honor and humility. It was a real pleasure to engage with each of you, and thank you for coming forward in the late hours in which you were all approached and stepping forward into this role of leadership. It's a quiet, quick leadership, but boy, does it have substance. I hope that you all feel proud for what you have brought into the world today, and all the good work that you are doing. You are truly, truly good friends of the filibuster movement. I wanted to thank our interpreters as well, and our captioner. They've been so faithfully with us, filibuster after filibuster, and thank you to the folks in the back end. Thank you to Gabrielle, who has been doing much and who actually was very generous the last couple of weeks as I took a bit of a sabbatical from active duty on the filibuster front line. So everybody has been working really hard, and we do it all for the same reason, because we love the people of our community and we want better for everyone. So we're going to wrap up. Oh, and I'm going to do something I always forget to do. You know, we have managed to continue to broadcast the filibuster. Every broadcast costs us somewhere around $1,000 to $1,500, and we don't, we don't have that big budget that the government of Canada has for their, or the Dying with Dignity has, but the government hearings, they have $50,000, and lots of paid staff, researchers, and technical people. We don't have that. We're volunteers. And we have a GoFundMe page. And so far, so good. We're going to be back again. We have several good broadcasts lined up. And so please, if you are able, spread the word. We will keep the broadcast coming. That is our commitment to our community. So thank you, Rain and Ramona, Tara and Sonia, from the bottom of my heart. What we will do now is we will conclude the filibuster. We will conclude our recording. We'll give the audience a few minutes or a moment to leave, and then we're just going to have a private chat, a debrief amongst ourselves. But if the rest of you folks would like to get on with your evening or your afternoon or your weekend, now is the time. This broadcast is now over.